Okay, so as you see, our topic for today is the ways of wisdom in the quest for justice. And that topic, that title alone might be enough to raise some important questions. One of which is probably, what do we mean by wisdom? I mean, that's a great question, y'all. Way to go. Way to go. Way to ask the hard questions. I think that one of the most effective ways of addressing that question is not necessarily to think about the content of justice first and foremost, but to think about our exemplars of justice. So for just a moment, I want you to think about, or I'm sorry, I've said justice when I mean wisdom, our exemplars of wisdom. And so for a moment, I want you to stop thinking about what comes to mind when we talk about wisdom, and instead think about who comes to mind. So who is someone that you would describe as wise? And why would you describe them as wise? So take just a moment and think about who that exemplar would be for you. Who'd like to share? Does somebody have someone who came to mind pretty quickly? Oh, yeah.
My dad is Dr. Cobb.
Dr. Cobb, and why does he come to mind?
That's cool because I've worked really closely with him for the past year, and we've become friends. I hope he reciprocates that. But what I really love is that when you talk to him, it doesn't matter what you're talking about, he's truly listening. Right? I always feel heard. I always feel seen, and he doesn't lie if he doesn't know the answer. His answers are always thoughtful, and helpful. Great.
That's high praise for a philosopher. I mean, that's
emotional support, even if it's just to say the situation really sucks and nothing about it. You know, and I have come to count on him as someone I can go to when I need wisdom and I don't know where to find it.
Great. Other exemplars that come to mind. Yeah.
I would say my elders.
Why?
Because they're usually, they've been through the things that you are go through lots of times. They have words that will maybe sometimes poke you, but then down the road you figure out, oh, that's what
they bring a kind of perspective to it. Yeah. Other examples? Yeah.
I don't know that I entirely personally believe this, but I would say as an example, I think it comes to mind is some white guy with a big beard.
Okay. Socrates or Tolstoy. Good example. Yeah.
A lot of time their advice is very helpful. Right.
90. That's a high number. I hope my kids would give me that rating. Yeah, in the back, and then we'll come up front for one more.
I would say, they're not like this.
Yeah.
I would say my nephews.
Your nephews, okay.
They're 10 years younger, but sometimes we'll have talks.
Yeah.
Like, you're really smart.
Yeah. That's great. Great examples. We have some great exemplars, and yet it can at times be hard. I think if we were to sit down and really analyze them, it might be hard for us to figure out exactly what we mean by wisdom, because they seem to exemplify some different things. For some of those, it's something more like a perspective about the nature of life. For others, it's about kind of, here's how to do things. And I think that example, or that makes sense in part because in English, we have this one word that we use, wisdom, to translate what are really two very different concepts. And so in other languages, there are multiple words for those concepts. For instance, in ancient Greek, they had two different words that we often translate with the word wisdom. The first of those is the word Sophia. And Sophia refers to an understanding of unchanging truths, an understanding of things that are always true, that are true about the nature of the universe, the nature of existence, people who are wise in this way might understand, for instance, physical laws, right? They might understand that E equals MC squared. If they really know what they're talking about, they might be able to explain to you what that means beyond just energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. They can tell you what that means, and I am not wise in that way. But they might understand, you know, a body at rest will tend to remain at rest unless acted upon by an external force. Or if or the A squared or A plus B equals B plus A. Things of that sort that describe the physical nature of the universe. Or people who are wise in this way might have a kind of understanding of the unchanging truths about existence or about human life. For instance, Socrates with the big beard, he of the big beard, was widely regarded as the wisest man in ancient Athens. And he was famous for saying that the only true wisdom consists in knowing that we know nothing. Right? No matter how much we know, it is but a drop in the ocean of knowledge. And that tells us something very deep and unchanging about human life and about the nature of human existence. Dr. King was famous for a number of sayings that were wise in this sort of way. For instance, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And I think we often find this kind of wisdom amongst our elders as well. My grandfather was widely noted for his sayings. Many of them weren't especially wise, and most of them were too colorful for me to say here. But I do remember one time I was talking to him when I was in college, and I was telling him about how rushed I felt, how busy I felt, and how I just felt like there wasn't time for some of the things I thought were really important. And he looked at me and said, well, Brad, if you don't take time, you'll never make time. I just was dumbfounded for a second. I mean, because there was a deep truth to that. We can't make time. We can only devote time to certain things. And that's one kind of wisdom, the kind that maybe leaves us just a bit dumbfounded for a second, feeling like we bumped up against an immovable reality, an unchanging truth. But there was a second word for wisdom in ancient Greek, and that is the word phronesis. And phronesis refers to an understanding of how to attain the greatest possible good or the most possible good for human beings in light of the circumstances in which we find ourselves. So phronesis is about how we act in the world and how we act in ways that attain the most morally desirable results. So it's not just knowing about things, it's knowing what to do with things. This is the kind of wisdom that is involved in the saying, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing it doesn't belong in a fruit salad. It's an unchanging truth that a tomato is a fruit, but knowing what to do with that fruit, that is about phronesis, right? That is about this kind of practical wisdom, this wisdom about what we do in the world. And so if at times Sophia can become, to borrow a phrase from Dr. King, so earthly or so heavenly minded that it is of no earthly good, phronesis is the opposite. It is intensely interested in the earthly conditions in which we find ourselves, in the particular situations that we encounter, and helping us navigate those situations in ways that bring the best possible results. So phronesis has three key features, we might say. One, it directs human actions. It's about how we act in the world. Second, it attends to the unique features of our situation. So it will notice what is different about this situation A from situation B, and it will take account of those. And by devoting that kind of attention to the specifics of our situations, it will direct our actions to seek the greatest possible good in our specific circumstances. So it is about how we act and how we attain the greatest possible good. But it's important to note here that this is different than mere cleverness. You can be clever in the pursuit of any goal whatsoever. You can only be wise in the pursuit of good goals. So take, for example, Batman's nemesis, the Joker. The Joker is endlessly clever. He is always finding a way to put Batman in situations that seem to assure death and destruction. But because his ends are death and destruction, he can be at best merely clever, not truly wise. Right? So you need to be seeking good goals. And that's one reason why wisdom of this sort, practical wisdom, phronesis, can be difficult to attain. But there's another reason. And that is because it requires us to bridge this gap between our ideals and the realities of the world in which we find ourselves. We need to find a way to bridge those ideals that we have, the ideals of justice, the ideals of equality, the ideals of what King would call the beloved community. Ideals that often stand starkly in contrast to the realities in which we find ourselves. And so phronesis calls us to this difficult bridging or balancing act. If we are to be wise in this way, we need to not just think about our ideals. We need to not just think about the realities in which we find ourselves. We need to find a way to take them both into account and to bridge them in our actions in the world. That's difficult. It's easy to simply be an idealist, to propound the highest goals, the highest ends, without any concern for how they are going to be realized in the world. And it's easy to be simply a realist, or I would actually say a cynic, and just to do what you can with what you have in light of the realities of the world without any concern for higher goals. It's hard to do both. It's hard to bring those both together. And yet it is crucial, it is essential in the quest for justice to do just that, to bring together our ideals, such as justice, with the realities of the world. And that was a kind of wisdom that was essential in the civil rights movement, and that I believe remains no less essential to our society today. And so this is why I want to talk about the ways that wisdom showed up in the quest for justice. Everybody on board so far? Does this make sense? So when we think about the ways in which wisdom shows up, I think we can get a good bit of guidance from two folks in particular. And so if I were asked this question that I asked you earlier, who are two people you were thinking you would describe as wise? Two people that I would name are folks, both of whom happen to be from my adopted home state of North Carolina, and both have ties to Durham, where I lived for 8 years. And those two folks are Paulie Murray and Bill Riddick. And I think one of the things that Paulie Murray and Bill Riddick show us, that you may first question be like, who are Paulie Murray and Bill Riddick? And that's actually one important thing that they show us about the role of wisdom in the civil rights movement, that it was everywhere. It was certainly amongst some of the leading figures, King, Bayard Rustin, Wyatt T. Walker being some who would come to mind, who are talked about a little bit in the Cradle of Freedom book. But it was elsewhere as well. It happened even to be in North Carolina, of all places. And it happened to be amongst people who we don't necessarily remember as central figures of the civil rights movement. But again, I think that they help us see a little bit about the ways in which wisdom shows up in the quest for justice. So I want to talk a little bit first about Paulie Murray. Who's heard of Paulie Murray before right this second? Or when actually Dr. Cobb mentioned her earlier today, right? Not a widely known figure, but someone who was actually really essential in some key moments in the civil rights movement. And Paulie Murray lived a remarkable life. She was born in Durham. She ultimately got a JD from Howard University, a doctorate of juridical science from Yale, She would go on to be part of the national board of the American Civil Liberties Union. And she would later in her life become the first African-American woman ordained in the Episcopal Church. She was raised in Durham. And when I think of her as an exemplar of wisdom, I think, first of all, of an episode in 1943 when she and others led a protest at Howard University. So this is 17 years before the sit-ins become a major thing. But Paulie Murray and her fellow organizers at Howard led a sit-in that was ultimately successful. That sit-in began when a fellow student named Ruth Powell was denied service at the lunch counter at the United Cigar Stores. After her mistreatment, Powell, Murray, and others decided that they needed to take action. They needed to do something in the world. Murray had already read War Without Violence, the very influential at the time study of Gandhi and his methods and thought. And she was convinced that those methods of satyagraha or soul force could be applied in the quest for civil rights. And so she and the organizers began to think about a process that would help them realize their ideals of justice using the methods of satyagraha in the particular space that they confronted, in the particular realities and circumstances they lived with it. And so they started by researching the state of segregation statutes in Washington, D.C. at the time. And Murray was the legal consultant, so this was her job. And then they went beyond to think about the amount of support they might have. So they polled the student body. If we were to do a sit-in, how much support would there be? It turned out 97% were on board. So they knew they had the law on their side. They knew they had students on their side, but they didn't stop there. They kept doing their research. They surveyed local eateries to find out what their practices were regarding segregation, regarding serving people of color. And this was in Washington, D.C. Yes, that's correct. Yeah. And they began doing their research. They found that one of the worst places in the area was a place called the Little Palace Cafeteria. And so they selected the Little Palace as the site for their first sit-in. But they didn't start just yet. They also realized if we're going to be successful, we need to know more and we need to train people in how to be successful. And so they ran a number of workshops for people that treated things like civil rights legislation, the laws around protesting and disorderly conduct, and also the methods of nonviolence. They had people pledge themselves to nonviolence, no matter how greatly they were provoked. And then the organizers selected fewer than 20 students to go in and be amongst those who would conduct the sit-in at the Little Palace Cafeteria. When they did, the owners of the Little Palace immediately called police. But when police showed up, all they found was a well-disciplined group of students asking to be served food in a way that was completely legal. You know how long it took for the Little Palace to be integrated? Fewer than 24 hours. And that was in part because of the research that Murray and her fellow organizers had done. But Murray was not just wise in finding ways to, in the sit-ins, but also in finding ways to dismantle Jim Crow, finding legal means to dismantle Jim Crow. As she was earning her JD at Howard, she would write a paper that would, through a series of steps, actually go on to shape the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, the most momentous judicial decision of the 19th century, I'm sorry, 20th century, and perhaps the most momentous judicial decision in the history of the United States. Now, when Murray first floated that idea, she did so in a class with a man named Spotswood Robinson. Here he is on the left with Thurgood Marshall. Spotswood Robinson, when he first heard the argument that Murray made, scoffed at her. He openly scoffed at her. But Murray understood that argument so well. She understood American jurisprudence. She understood the 13th and 14th Amendments. And she understood the changing character of the judiciary, that she wasn't going to back down. In fact, she bet Spotswood Robinson on the spot. She bet him $10, which is not like us betting $10, probably more like us betting $60, $70, that Plessy versus Ferguson would be overturned within a decade. And she was proven right. Not only was she proven right, but she was proven right in part because Spotswood Robinson was so impressed with the final paper that she produced of this argument that he took it with him. He would go on to become part of the legal defense team of the NAACP. And he would bring with him Murray's paper, which argued, at least in part, that it started from the 1883 assertion that the 13th Amendment was intended to abolish what was, quote, the badges and incidents of slavery. And she combined that with a reading of the 14th Amendment, which promises equal protection. And then she introduced in a novel way, in a way nobody really had in legal argumentation up to that point, social scientific literature that showed that African Americans were being consigned to a subservient position in the United States. And she argued that that position constituted an enduring badge and incident of slavery, and thus that Plessy versus Ferguson was unconstitutional. And that is the argument that would prevail. That is the argument that would shape the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And that argument came out of Murray's deep wisdom in understanding the ideals of justice, but also understanding the particular situation in which she found herself. And Murray would display that kind of wisdom also, not just in trying to dismantle Jim Crow, but also in trying to dismantle what she called Jane Crow, the systematic exclusion of women. And one of the cases that she played a role in was here in Alabama, in Lowndes County, Alabama. There's a case called White v. Crook. And it was filed by the ACLU. Yes, there was a very big joke about the White Crook case. It was not accidental, entirely accidental, but we ended up with the case White Crook. But when the ACLU filed, at the time, let me explain for just a second. At the time, Alabama barred Black men from serving on juries by informal mechanisms, but they barred all women from serving on juries by statute, by law. And Murray had long made the argument that this was categorically different and that all such laws should be overturned on the basis of the 14th Amendment. There was a novel analogization or connection that she made between racial discrimination and gender discrimination. It's at the time, it was not part of American jurisprudence, but she helped to make it part of American jurisprudence. And in that case, they filed the case against a man named Bruce Crook, who was the jury commissioner in Lowndes County, on behalf of Gardenia White, who was part of the Lowndes County Christian Human Rights Association. And so they filed this case, and Murray, on a very tight timeline, wrote a major portion of the brief for the ACLU. And in that, she argued, one, that these laws should be overturned on the basis of the argument that I just laid out, but also, two, that the argument that the law was arbitrary. And it was arbitrary in no small part, she said, because at the time, do you know who the head of the State Court of Appeals was? It was a woman named Lola Price. And Lola Price could preside over the state's court, but she couldn't serve on a jury in the state. And Murray points out how arbitrary this is. And so again, it's this deep understanding of the particularities of the situation, right? Particularities around what the laws are, who's serving in particular positions, and so on. And using her knowledge of that to direct that towards greater justice. When we turn to Bill Riddick, I think we find a couple of different, or a different way in which wisdom shows up in the civil rights movement. So let me tell you a little bit about Bill Riddick before we kind of break down what's going on in these various cases. So Bill Riddick played a role in the integration of city schools in Durham, North Carolina. This is actually Hillside High School, which is where Paulie Murray went to high school. Following the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the city of Durham, Brown versus Board of Education, as you may remember, in the famous phrase, ordered that integration should happen with all deliberate speed. Durham's deliberate speed turned out to be at least 15 years. By 1969, they had still not integrated the schools, but that became unavoidable when the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ordered Durham to integrate its schools. And so by 1970, there was a plan in place for integration. Integration was happening, but a number of crises followed from that. Some of those crises were sparked by the fact that the more affluent white students began to leave the city schools entirely, began going into what are these private, what are called segregation academies. Of course, they wouldn't call themselves that, but we can call them that. And that left Durham city schools underfunded, under-resourced, under-supported. At the same time, there were rising tensions within the city because the Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a resurgence. And so there was this very difficult moment where Durham city schools were experiencing a huge crisis, and Durham as a city was experiencing a huge crisis. And it wasn't clear there was a way forward until somebody at the North Carolina Department of Health, Education, and Wellness decided to call Bill Riddick. Riddick at the time was the director of extension education at Shaw University in Raleigh. And he had by that time an established record leading a process, a deliberation process called a charrette. And Bill Riddick would later write this book, Charrette Processes. So what is a charrette? A charrette, as they've been practiced, then and since then, a charrette is an extended face-to-face meeting that is intended to bring out different ideas, diverging viewpoints. And the way that they were practiced in Durham was that they would go from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. for 10 days in a row in the heat of the summer. And so Riddick is leading this charrette, and he's leading it because he believes that if you bring these views out into the open, if they can be articulated, people can find common ground and at least begin conceiving of possible common solutions. But he thinks in order to do that, you need to represent as many people as possible. And in part because of that, he decides, well, I think that conviction of his becomes very apparent when he names the two co-chairs of the Durham charrette. The first is a woman named Ann Atwater, who was a progressive Black activist with an organization called Project Breakthrough. And the second was a man named C.P. Ellis, who was at the time the exalted cyclops of the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. So many people thought Riddick had assured calamity by naming these two co-chairs. They would be proven wrong, however improbably, they would be proven wrong. And through a series of events, I don't even know if the events are portrayed. There's a movie about them that Netflix did called The Best of Enemies, which greatly modifies what actually happened in Durham at the time. That series of events is more accurately portrayed in Osha Gray Davidson's book by the same title, The Best of Enemies. But through that series of events, Atwater and Ellis would realize they actually had similar concerns about the quality of education in Durham city schools. They would realize that they actually had shared similar forms of mistreatment. They would become friends. And ultimately, on the last night of the charrette, in front of all people gathered, C.P. Ellis would tear up his KKK car. Now, real life, as we know, rarely has Hollywood endings. And this by no means solved all of the problems that plagued Durham City Schools. But it did lead to a new era of interracial collaboration. And for that reason, on the Durham Civil Rights mural, which stands prominently in downtown, this is a big part of it. We see the SOS, which stood for Save Our Schools, charrette, and we see Ann Atwater and CPL standing side by side, doing their work to improve the public schools. And all of that was made possible by the wisdom of Bill Riddick. And by his attention, not just to the ideals of justice, but also to the particularities of the situation in Durham and of the minefield of racial politics in Durham, and his use of promising conflict negotiation or conflict management. So I think when we look at Riddick and Murray side by side, we see a couple of different things about the way in which wisdom shows up in the quest for justice. And I think they show us three major ways that wisdom shows up. The first is that at times wisdom might take the form of severing the social fabric. And here I'm going to use this common metaphor of the social fabric to help us think about this, which seems also appropriate because Durham's growth as a city was driven in large part by the textile industry. But at times, wisdom shows up in the severing of the social fabric. History has vividly attested that the social fabric can be so unjustly ill-fitting that it is little more than a straitjacket. And in certain cases, the wisest thing to do might be to take out the scissors and begin cutting. And when Paulie Murray and her fellow protesters at Howard were confronted by such a misformed social fabric, they took out the scalpel of the sit-in and they began looking for new ways, for the places to cut. Now, in their case, they had law on their side because in Washington, D.C. at the time, segregation reigned not by law, but by custom. I think our exemplars here in Alabama might show us that at times we need to cut not just the fabric of customs, but even of constitutions. But in such cases, there are times when we need to cut, when severing the social fabric is in fact the wisest thing to do. But wisdom will also recognize that that's not true in every case. A second way in which wisdom shows up is in this, what we might call the stretching of the social fabric. Not in the severing of the social fabric, but the stretching of the social fabric. And this is what Murray devoted a great deal of her legal career to. As she saw it, there was nothing fundamentally wrong with the fabric provided by the 13th and 14th Amendments. What was wrong was the way in which those had been interpreted, the form that had been given to them by certain judicial decisions. And so she spent a great deal of her career trying to stretch the social fabric in new ways, trying to make it fit new shapes. And she did that in her legal scholarship, in her writings, in her work for the ACLU and the National Organization for Women, as well as elsewhere. I think we find a third way in which wisdom can show up in the quest for justice in Bill Riddick. And that he shows us that at least at times, at the right times and in the right places, wisdom will take the form of reweaving the social fabric, trying to mend that fabric. In 1971 in Durham, Bill Riddick encountered a social fabric that had been torn apart, torn asunder, rent by the forces of racial prejudice, by the forces of discrimination. And he began to think of new ways that they might be able to reweave the social fabric. He was able to do that by paying close attention to what was happening in Durham. And so each of these three forms, severing, stretching, and reweaving the social fabric, might be wise at each particular moment. I think there are ways in which wisdom shows up. I think wisdom might also, however, recognize, and I'm going to throw out a very loaded claim here that we can unpack later if you want, but wisdom might recognize that all three of these might be able to exist at the same time. Okay, but that ultimately brings us to the big question. So what? Very nice historical examples, Brad. What in the world does this mean for us today? What does this mean in 2023 and in the climate, in the place that we confront now? I think one of the things it means is that wisdom still has a lot of work to do. And if wisdom is going to do the work that we need it to do, we need to train ourselves and find ways to train others to become more wise. And that is a crucial piece of what we try to do in the program for leadership and character. So I want to start here in this part by saying we do not have all the answers. I don't think we have all the answers. We have a lot to learn, and we have a lot to learn, especially from you all in this room and in this program. But our approach begins with the idea that wisdom is not just an innate gift. It's not something we're born with. And it's not some gift from the heavens. It is a virtue. And like all virtues, it has a developmental quality. That is to say that we can grow it, we can nurture it, we can foster it, we can improve it. We don't just come into the world with all the wisdom we're ever going to have. And, thank God for that. What we can do is help people to grow in wisdom. How do we do that? Well, in our program, we've found that there is significant empirical evidence for 7 strategies to help cultivate wisdom, but also to cultivate other virtues. Those are laid out most fully in an article that's co-written by Michael Lamb, who's our executive director, called How is Virtue Cultivated? He also co-edited a book called Cultivating Virtue in the University. I want to talk real briefly about each one of those 7 strategies. The first is habituation through practice. So how do we help people become more virtuous? Well, we help them to become more virtuous by doing virtuous things, by encouraging them to practice virtue in their own lives. For instance, if you want to become more grateful, if you want to enhance the virtue of gratitude, right? Well, what's one way of becoming grateful? By being grateful, right? So you might set a reminder on your phone every day at 4:30, what are you grateful for today? Studies show if you do that over the course of time, you will enhance the virtue of gratitude. Similarly, if we want students to become more wise, right? We might put them in situations where we ask them to analyze what are the ideals that you're seeking? What are the realities you're confronting? What are the potential obstacles that you face? And by developing that kind of habit of analyzing our ideals and our realities, we can help enhance wisdom. We might also help students reflect on their own personal experiences. Where are you? Where are you struggling? What are you going through? How have you grown in the past? How might you want to grow in the future? These are crucial ways of reflecting on our own experience that can help us become more virtuous. We might also engage with virtuous exemplars. We're doing that a lot in this program. We've seen a lot of virtuous exemplars from the civil rights movement. But exemplars aren't just historical figures. They might be present, very present figures in your own life. You might have teachers. You might have family members. You might have friends who show you what it means to live a good life. We also can engage in dialogue that increases virtue literacy. This is another strategy for increasing virtues. One way we become more virtuous is by understanding what virtues mean, right? We spent a lot of time today, for instance, talking about what wisdom means. We'll spend a little bit of time this afternoon talking about what empathy means. And understanding those things will help us become more virtuous. We can also become more aware of situational pressures and variables. No matter how virtuous we become, there are always forces that are pushing us against virtue. There are ways in which we're likely to be biased. There are ways in which we're likely, or times at which we're likely to not be our best selves, right? You know the concept of hangry, right? You know, when you're hungry, you tend to get angry. You tend not to be your best self. Recognizing that about yourself, that you're someone, I don't tend to get hangry. My wife gets hangry. And that is, she would admit that. That's not just me telling tales. You know, she would admit that, right? But recognizing I may not be in the best space right now for that, being aware of that situational variable. Moral reminders, finding ways to remind ourselves of our ideals. And then finally, friendships of mutual support and accountability. So finding friends who are trying to live into the virtues we want to embody and who are also willing to hold us accountable to those virtues. These are very important ways in which we can grow in virtue. I want to spend and we're almost at time, so I'm going to jump through real quick. One of the, I want to talk about two things that we've done in our program that I think exemplify this. One is legacies of leadership. And I'm going to go real quick through this one so we can talk about the second one, but just a minute longer. And this was an event a series of events actually that commemorated the 1960 sit-in in Winston-Salem, which was in fact the first sit-in victory in North Carolina. And as part of that, we had a number of special events that involved discussion groups, involved a visit to the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro. They also had opportunities for students to make a piece of art that reflected a present issue in their community. And it culminated in a vigil and a march that celebrated the original participants in the sit-in who came from Winston-Salem Teachers College, which has since become Winston-Salem State University, Atkins High School, and Wake Forest College, now Wake Forest University. And so in that, we had engagement with virtuous exemplars. We see here Victor Johnson, who was at the time the last surviving participant in those original sit-ins. We also gave opportunities for students to reflect on their own personal experiences, thinking about the issues that confront their community, thinking about their own biases particularly. And through this, although habituation through practice takes more than just even a week-long series of events, our hope was to help students begin taking steps to be the kind of engaged and wise citizens who recognize the ways in which our country, our city falls short of justice, while also seeing the possibilities to act constructively towards it. The second initiative I want to talk about is the Principled Pluralism Fellowship. And I want to give this a little bit more time because I lead it. I've had the privilege of leading this fellowship for the last 3 years. And it's an intensive 8-week fellowship over the summer. And it is patterned as an extended charrette. It has been said that what the fellowship involves is me locking students in a room and making them fight for 8 weeks. But I guarantee you that is a joke. It's only a joke. We do a lot more than that. We share our stories. We get to know one another. We eat together, and we build really deep bonds with one another. But I do want to have the kind of intense reaction that Bill Riddick was seeking in Durham in 1971. I want students to disagree. And so we talk about some of the hot button issues in our society, issues like gun control, abortion, capital punishment, and much more. I want students to have that experience of disagreeing with somebody and being able to work with them anyway. The whole point of this fellowship is to help students develop the skills and virtues to work constructively across those kinds of differences. But those differences don't exist if we don't let them exist, if we don't draw them out and help students to recognize that they disagree, and yet they don't need to judge the other person as somehow terrible. So through this, we reflect often on our own personal experiences. We talk a lot about how our present culture in its racist, sexist, politically divided, polarized state has injured us, how it has led us also to injure others. We also reflect on the many ways in which our relationships shape who we are. We talk a lot about virtues. And so we try to enhance this virtue literacy. For instance, we talk about empathy. And how is empathy always good? How do we keep empathy, for instance, from making us feel attached only to those who are like us and not to those who are different from us? Or we also talk about things like practical wisdom and intellectual humility. We also do moral reminders. This is an example here of moral reminders we made in the fellowship. This is an example of what's called kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of mending broken ceramics. So in a session that was led by my colleague Ann Phelps, who's been trained in that by a kintsugi master named Mako Fujimura, we mended these ceramics and we reflected on how that work was like the work needed to mend a society that is riven by forces like sexism, racism, political polarization, interreligious strife, and more. And we threw this over and over again, day after day, entering into difficult conversations, helped to habituate students, I hope, into entering conversations in ways that are curious rather than judgmental, and that are principled without being imperious. Hope to get them to have the kinds of habits of entering into those conversations in ways that are most likely to be constructive. And through it all, we hopefully built very strong friendships. Certainly the first year we did this, those students are incredibly close friends. And I can say that because it's been a couple of years now, you know, because they're sort of that, like, we grow away. But they continue to call one another. I continue to occasionally to be on the text chain occasionally when they want to knock me. But you know, the text chain is called Brad the Dad. Yeah, so it's mainly about mocking me, but that's okay. But wisdom was crucial in the civil rights movement. Wisdom remains crucial today. It is going to be crucial if we are going to move closer to the ideal of justice. But justice is something we never fully attain in this world. Justice is something that we always remain on the way to because someone is always left out. There's always better we can do. And so in the midst of this society that is struggling towards justice, that has yet to realize the promise of the civil rights movement, wisdom has work to do. And wisdom is going to need to keep doing that work if we're going to make progress in our quest to justice. Thank you. Questions?
We have time, and I'd love to open space for questions. So, who would like to jump in first?
Earlier in the presentation, what came to mind was like the difference between book smart and street smart.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you think there's anything, especially in the K through 12 education system, if there's any subject or something you think is really missing for young people.
Well, I mean, it's frequently said, you know, a lot of life skills are missing. You know, how do you you know, I don't balance my checkbook anymore, so I don't feel good giving that as an example, right? But there are a lot of practical realities that we don't fully appreciate, even in when it comes to, I think, especially local politics. That's one place. What part of the Principal Pluralism Fellowship that happens to happen every year is, and it's happened by accident, but I teach everybody how to change a tire and check their oil and things like that. But I think there are lots of other things, right? I do think now it's becoming a neuralgic point, a point people have some worries about. But I think social emotional learning is one of those things, the framework is at least trying to name some of the things that we weren't always good at. We weren't always good at recognizing the ways in which our actions, for instance, impact others. I think those are points that in K through 12 spaces are really important, and that yeah, we struggle with and could do a little bit better in recognizing. Yeah, if you don't have questions, I'm gonna start asking them of you. So
Thank you for your talk. Okay, so wisdom depends on knowing what's of value, and so what do we do in a pluralistic society where people disagree about what's most important?
yeah, great question. I think we begin by talking about it, right? We're often I want to not get on my rant here, but we're not particularly good at ethics education or value education. I think when it comes to, say, the principal pluralism fellowship, the principle is there for a reason. It's not just the pluralism fellowship. It's a fellowship in which we want people to actually be open about taking a stand. Too often pluralism ends up being, let's reduce it to the lowest common denominator. And we're not, and so we never have meaningful disagreements with one another. And I think that creating spaces for people to talk more openly about their values and why they value them is really important. One of the frameworks that we've found helpful in the Principal Pluralism Fellowship is a framework called Moral Foundations Theory, which is articulated most prominently by a guy named Jonathan Haidt at NYU. And Haidt talks about the ways in which he would identify, and there's a sort of confidence to this that I don't fully embrace, but he would say there are only these 6. I think, well, come on, let's hold back. But there are 6 sort of what he calls moral taste receptors that we all have. Things like, and I won't get all 6 of them, but equality, fairness, authority, obedience, and so on, right? But that often, and that we all value them in certain places and in certain ways. And we never actually find out what is at the bottom of other people's values, because we are not very good at having those conversations. And so having those conversations and helping to realize that what other people value may not be entirely different than what I value, even if those values appear very, very different. That creates an opportunity for conversation. But we're very nervous about those kinds of conversations in our society. My mom still adheres to the rule, or imposes the rule, I guess I should say, that you don't talk about religion and politics. Of course, what did I go but get a PhD in religion and politics, basically. But anyway, but because we don't talk about those things, we don't talk about those things because we're afraid they're going to divide us. But not talking about those allows our divisions to simply calcify, and for us not fully to understand what lies behind the values of those on the other side. Now, is every place an opportunity for that? No. There are times, as Dr. Snow said yesterday, where it might involve danger. It might put you in a very bad situation. And I'm not saying that you need to take every opportunity. But when the time is right, when the place is right, I think we do need to have those conversations, because that helps us to understand other people a lot better than as if we're working with this kind of fictive idea of public reason, or we just don't understand why people hold the values now.
Hi, I'm from Valdosta, Georgia.
Yeah.
Of all places, Valdosta started to desegregate their public schools in the mid-'60s, and that was attributed largely to high school athletics. When did North Carolina get comfortable with the idea of desegregation?
There's some question about whether we are still comfortable with the idea. So one of the things that North Carolina did shortly after Brown versus Board was that they passed a law that made integration the responsibility of every local school district. And they did that because it kept the state, one, it was a sort of gambit by people in the state, at state levels of government, to not have to deal with the issue. But then it made it so that every district, instead of fighting one fight for integration of public schools, now you're fighting 300 fights over integration of public schools. And so it was very different in different parts of the state. Even the 1969 decision by the Fourth Circuit Court was applicable to Durham, But other school districts argue, well, wait, we don't have the same problems as Durham. It's different here. And so that decision did lead some other school districts to integrate, but not all. Many were still able to kind of bob and weave and evade.
So when did the federal marshal step in?
We didn't. I do not believe we did. Let me not be so confident about that. Now, there were certain cities like Raleigh that had a very vigorous busing policy, but we never had the governor standing in the doorway of a school or something like that, and being confronted by federal marshals. At least that I'm aware of. And again, I grew up in rural Western New York, so I'm not, yeah.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. As you probably know, we are relatively early in our process of developing our civic virtues community here at AUM. I think one of the next things that we'll talk about more, I think we're already starting to hint at it, is that we want to draw a wider range of our community into this conversation, wider range of political backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, or white people, frankly.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, how in your program, what advice would you give? Would you give us to draw a wider range of people into this community?
It's a great question. It's a really difficult one to deal with, in part because of the realities of self-selection. I would say in our Principal Pluralism Fellowship, most of the students are more liberal, and pretty much all of the students already value pluralism to some degree. You're not going to spend 8 weeks of your summer talking about pluralism unless you think it's something that is worthwhile to pursue or value in some way. And so that does create some difficulties in terms of that self-selection problem. That said, I think there are ways, with one of the things we've had good luck with, or good fortune, good results with in the past, is specifically nominating students, being in touch with faculty members and asking them to tap students, tell students, here's the person who nominated you. Often that's, somebody that they like or respect in some way. Helping, I think it's also it's never, those in faculty and staff roles should never underestimate how powerful it can be to name for students the gifts that they bring, whether that's, in their career or to their field of study or to an experience like this. To name for them, like, hey, you have a ton of gifts. You do this so well. You do that so well. And it would be a real benefit for us to learn from you. And I think it would also be a benefit for you. But I have said in the past, and probably continue to say in the present, I will teach anyone about anything, anytime, anywhere. Just don't make me recruit them to be there. Because that is where the hardest work, I think, happens. That finding the students, connecting with them, helping them to see what you're doing as being a worthwhile use of their time when they're so busy, when they have so many things going on. That's a real difficult challenge that I think, frankly, we all face on all college campuses. So at the very least, also start with have hope. Don't be, don't be like, oh, this is an impossible mountain to climb. It is. I think it's a nut that can be cracked. But every new initiative requires finding the way that works for that one.
Thank you.
You said in your fellowship program, you guys talk about difficult topics.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to things like racism or colorism or like transphobia,
yeah,
those things you can't like be halfway about. You like completely against them or you're somehow for them.
Yeah.
So how do you go about dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We do talk about those things, but they tend not to become like a topic of debate. There are certain things where, for instance, capital punishment is at Wake Forest. It's an issue on which people are legitimately on both sides. and I think have good reasons for being on both sides. That's a great opportunity for us to openly disagree with one another, and to try to think through what our values are and what our disagreements mean and what they maybe don't mean. There are other topics that aren't very good for that. And I think you're naming topics that aren't very good for that. And so when we approach those topics, it's often, how do we respond to, interact with those who are on the other side of this issue? I'm not making room in those cases for people to be like, well, I am a white supremacist and that's fine. So I think, so we do talk about those topics, but they tend not to be ones that are, broadly open for debate.
Okay, so I do have a question. With your fellowship, this is last for a semester or get you one every?
Yeah, so thank you. Good question. So it's over the summer and it's 8 weeks. We meet every weekday for 8 weeks.
So which is like during the summer, do you feel like that's enough to like mold them to leader and help them change the way they think? Because like here, even with our city virtual program, they just started last semester. Every these months they have, so I think it's dinner in these months. Some of them speaks and have birthdays, 1 to 2. But do you feel like with the 8-week training, how hardcore it is? Do you think the students are actually soaking in and actually taking in what they're learning and being able to teach others what they have?
Great question. Anytime we think about the cultivation of virtue, I think it's important for us to realize the role of free will, and that human beings have free will to engage or to disengage. And I do not, like if we go back to those 7 strategies, you put all those 7 strategies into place and somebody could come out vicious rather than virtuous. Why? Because they have the free will to engage with that stuff, to that topic in the way that they would. You cannot force virtue, right? Because virtue is an operation of the will. And so that is my main proviso. That said, I do think that we have a pretty good record. The number one question I deal with after the fellowship is, how do I find a job doing what we did in the fellowship? How do I find a job that does that kind of work? Because students really do come away valuing it. They come away equipped with a set of skills and virtues that make them what's suited for that kind of work. A lot of in our anonymous assessments of the program, one of the things that frequently comes up is students describe it as life-changing. If it is life-changing, though, it is life-changing because they invest in it. But I do think 8 weeks is 8 weeks meeting every day. That's more than enough time to have to put up with me. So yeah, I think we have pretty good results. But again, there's always that free will that someone can go in a different direction.
I'm kind of struggling with that racist question. It seems to me that a lot of times when we have these conversations, when we have these attempts to talk about social justice, equality, etc., what we do to run the means, this kind of zero-sum assumption on the part of a significant number of white people that Black, anybody else gaining equality or parity of any kind, somehow take something of what we do, it's losing. And why would they contribute honesty to engaging in something in which they figure they can only do? How do we address that foundation? Thinking that it is only X amount of, I guess, equality or kindness or tolerance or whatever you go around, and it's extended on those people. They're oriented for big kind of that panicky dynamic that sometimes seems to be at the base of a lot of stuff that we're seeing like right now.
Yeah, great question. And here I want to say I have thoughts, but I do not have answers. And I think, but I do think and part of the reason I don't have answers is because I don't know that there is the answer. There are answers that are sensitive to the particular constellation of motivations and fears that any particular person has. However, one of the things that I found, and I grew up, the North Carolina is where I live now, I grew up in very rural Western New York, a very conservative area. And so I recognize your description in a lot of the folks that I grew up with. And depending, for some of them who are potentially more academically inclined, I might say, well, wait, you believe in free market economics, right? And then, of course they do. They live in rural Western New York, so that goes without saying. They're not a commie, right? Like, I said, well, you realize that what you say kind of goes against the very fundamental assumptions of free market economics, which is, if you look at people like Adam Smith, that allowing more people into the activities of production actually results in a net gain in overall productivity and produce. Now, I can't say I fully ascribe to that idea, but that is their logic, right? So Jeff Stout at Princeton talked a lot about immanent criticism. So immanent criticism is when you don't criticize somebody from your frame of reference. Oh, well, you're wrong for believing that, but try to inhabit their frame of reference, right? What are their values? What are the things they're likely to believe? And to articulate an argument from that, right? So even if I don't necessarily believe Adam Smith was right about everything, Adam Smith, at least for a time, might be my intellectual helper to make that argument of, well, hey, that doesn't fly. Another example is to share personal experiences and to share, so my step grandfather was Afro-Puerto Rican. He was a migrant worker for many years before he ultimately got a permanent job with a vineyard in Western New York where they grew Concord grapes. And Grandpa Ben worked incredibly hard, right? So when people are like, oh, these foreigners, technically he wasn't a foreigner, he was a US citizen from the beginning, right? But he worked with a lot of folks who were migrant workers. And, oh, they're coming, they're lazy, they're taking this, they're taking that. And I can say, well, here's what I know from my grandfather's experience and the experience of the folks that he worked with. They're not lazy. They're doing jobs that most people don't want to do. And I know that because I didn't want to do it. I went out and worked with Grandpa Ben plenty of times, and I did not want to go back. First time I had a chance to get a different job, I jumped at it because it was very, very difficult work. And so, again, there are a lot of misconceptions that grow up around these things. And entering into conversation sometimes allows us to find out what particular form of misconception people might have and to draw them into conversation.
I just want to piggyback also about one of the big question. I have a t-shirt with the slogan, your right for others doesn't mean your right for you. It's not high, right? And I think that's what I'm trying to tell you is pointing out the benefits of living in a less racist, for example, society, or the cost of living in a racist society.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah, right. And also though, that there are times when it's a little bit more like pie if we made a distinction between negative rights and positive rights that keep people from interfering with us versus the right to certain social goods, right? There is only so much of particular goods to go around. Often, however, I also find that a great number of people have misconceptions about how those goods are actually being apportioned. C.P. Ellis, when he talks about his experiences, he talked about how in the 50s and 60s, he was convinced that Blacks were getting everything. They were getting all the good stuff. And part of what happened in his own story in the charrette is he visited Black schools in Durham. And he saw, actually, he had a lot of misconceptions about where those goods were going, and that that the wealthy in Durham often ended up with a lot more goods than the poor, whether you were white or Black. And so he recognized, as a poor white, he actually shared a lot more in common with poor Blacks than he ever would have thought.
I want to exercise the right because I have the question.
Yeah.
So earlier, Dr. Little mentioned, what do you do when you have disagreements about fundamental values? How do you address those, especially some practical wisdoms about figuring out the best ways to achieve the goods related to those values. My question is a little different in the sense that this is going back to something Dr. Deckers talked about earlier this week. He talked about there were different groups of folks involved in the civil rights movement who were completely unanimous in terms of the goals.
Yeah.
But they had big differences of opinion about strategies and tactics for the achievement of those goals.
Yeah.
And you see this, I think, often this is talked about in the context of what do we do about nonviolence versus armed self-defense or things of that nature? What are the best strategies in this space? And so this seems to me like a question that practical wisdom should help us to address.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, I'm just thinking on it, and this is a poorly formed question because I don't know the answer to this. Like, what do you do when the disagreements are about what practical wisdom really shows us in spaces like this, where you have folks who have complete unanimity about goals, but there's serious division about the best ways to achieve those goals. Yeah. And even to the point, to make the point, I guess a little finer, sharper or something. What do we do about violent means to achieve good goals? Is there a space for wisdom to say, this is the space where the reality of it is we need to exercise violence to achieve our goals?
Yeah, and I think it's so first of all, numerous things, as somebody who also does a good bit of work on war and violence, it's really important to as I know you know, but to say to everyone, right, to distinguish between, say, armed self-defense and aggressive use of violent means, right? So are we defending ourselves against violent potential attackers, or are we going out and, say, trying to overthrow a government or something like that? So I think there's an important moral distinction there. But I do think this is one of the things that I am struck by. And I do not read this the same way every historian of the civil rights movement does. But there are key moments, especially later in their careers, where King and Malcolm X recognize themselves as not actually being that far removed from one another. And that there is, in fact, much greater room for multiple methods and multiple forms of rhetoric than what they maybe even allowed for earlier in their careers. James Cone, who's a prominent Black theologian, has a book called Martin and Malcolm and America. And Cone argues, actually, you needed Martin and Malcolm. You needed both of them. You needed the movement towards the realization of civil rights, needed the kind of vigorous engagement and even nonviolent engagement that someone like King and others, as we've talked about, many others brought to the civil rights movement. But that threat of by any means necessary wasn't necessarily all bad. That's in Cone's reading. And I think that this is that sort of pregnant claim that I threw out there of, like, I think wisdom might also be able to recognize that multiple means can exist at the same time as helping us move towards particular goals. There's a theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr, who's probably the most prominent theologian, Christian thinker of the 20th century. And in his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, he has this place where he says, well, the realization of justice requires the statesman, requires the person who's going to make policy, but it also requires the prophet who's going to call the statesman into question at every step and call us to greater justice. And we need both of those. And I do think that there is a much greater possibility for what I would call a moral division of labor than what we sometimes recognize. And that just because I believe here's the way here are the values I want to advance, and here's the methods that I think are most effective in that, doesn't mean that somebody else can't do something else that contributes to the realization of the same goal.
Taking the question.
So for me, gender and race kind of overlap moderately. But it sounded like what Murray was saying was maybe more than that. And I was just kind of wondering for her kind of analogy of if, you know, women are basically disenfranchised and so are blacks, was that in kind of your understanding of their understanding, restitching the fabric, stretching the fabric, or just cutting the fabric?
Excuse me. I would call that stretching the fabric. I mean, so Murray's argument is that there's an analogy between race and gender in that both are things we have no control over, right? I mean, that you're born. Now, actually, Murray's own story is really fascinating. There's a relatively recent biography by Rosalind Rosenberg called Jane Crow about Murray, and she goes into a lot greater detail of Murray's gender identity, which Murray was probably what we would now call transgender. She did not fully identify as a woman or had difficulty with that identification. But anyways, in any case, right, for Murray, right, this idea of a female body is like onto being born with a particular color skin. You have no influence over it, and so it should not, in the same way that the civil rights laws around race were meant to mitigate the impact of that on your life chances. We should similarly have recognized legislation and in that sense stretch that to a similar case in which women, for instance, had their life chances dramatically impacted on account of the particular form of body that they were born into. So I would see that as a stretching